Alistair Finch believed that the world was composed primarily of sharp edges and the slow, inevitable oxidation of the soul. He spent his days in a cramped studio off Marigold Mews in Bristol, a space that smelled of linseed oil, ancient dust, and the metallic tang of precision tools. As a restorer of 18th-century nautical charts, Alistair lived his life through a magnifying loupe, squinting at the faded coastlines of empires that no longer existed, tracing the ink ghosts of explorers who had long since been reclaimed by the sea. He liked the maps because they were finite. They had borders, even if those borders were patrolled by illustrated sea monsters. His own life, by contrast, felt like a vast, unmapped fog. The rain in Bristol was not a sudden event, but a permanent condition of the spirit. On this particular Tuesday, it draped itself over the city like a heavy, sodden wool coat. Alistair watched the droplets race down the leaded glass of his window, wondering at what point a man decides he has become entirely translucent. He was 45, though he felt like a collection of Victorian gears, functional perhaps, but increasingly prone to sticking in the cold. He left his studio at 5, the damp air instantly colonizing the space between his collar and his neck. His destination was not home, but a small, unassuming establishment tucked between a violin repair shop and a boarded-up greengrocer. It was called the Alchemist's Kettle, though it sold neither potions nor gold. It sold tea, and by extension, it sold a quietude that Alistair found increasingly necessary for his survival. The bell above the door chimed a silver, crystalline sound that seemed to cut through the hum of his own tinnitus. "Good evening, Alistair. You look as though you've been caught in a gale off Cape Horn." Elara Thorne did not look up from the tin she was measuring. She was a woman of deliberate movements, her hand steady as she scooped dried lavender and bergamot into a scale. She was younger than Alistair, perhaps in her mid-30s, but she possessed a sort of geological patience, a stillness that suggested she had reached an understanding with time that he was still desperately negotiating. "The weather is uncharitable," Alistair managed, unbuttoning his coat with fingers that felt like wooden pegs. "The weather is honest," Elara countered, finally looking up. Her eyes were the colour of Earl Grey tea held up to the light. "It doesn't pretend to be anything other than a saturation. Sit, I've just put the water on." Alistair took his usual seat in the corner, a wingback chair that had surrendered its structural integrity decades ago. He watched her. This was his ritual, his secret medicine. He didn't come for the caffeine or the warmth, though both were welcome. He came for the way Elara moved. She treated every action the rinsing of a porcelain pot, the lighting of a small candle, the sweeping of a stray leaf as if it were a sacred liturgy. In Alistair's world, everything was a struggle against decay. He spent his hours fighting the yellowing of paper, the brittleness of vellum, the fading of indigo. He saw the world as a series of things losing their grip, but Elara seemed to exist in a state of constant, gentle maintenance. She didn't fight the world, she tended to it. "You're thinking about the maps again," she said, bringing a tray over. She didn't ask, she observed. "I'm thinking about a specific map," he admitted, his voice sounding thin in the quiet shop. "A 1742 chart of the Hebrides. The ink is flaking. It's as if the islands are trying to vanish back into the Atlantic. I spent 4 hours today trying to anchor a single peninsula with a needle point. Brush, it felt arrogant. Arrogant. To think I can stop the erasing. To think I can hold back the tide with a bit of gum arabic and pigment." Elara set the tea down. She didn't move away. She stood there, the steam from the pot curling around her wrists like white silk. "It's not arrogance to care for what remains, Alistair. It's a form of mercy." She reached out a gesture so sudden and yet so soft that he didn't have time to recoil and adjusted the scarf around his neck. Her fingers brushed the skin of his throat for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a romantic touch, not in the traditional, cinematic sense. It was the touch of a person checking the pulse of a bird. It was medicinal. Alistair felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, a sensation of something frozen beginning to crack. He had spent years constructing a suit of armour out of cynicism and professional detachment. He had convinced himself that solitude was a refined choice, a way to avoid the messy, unpredictable friction of human intimacy. But in the face of her uncomplicated kindness, his defences felt absurdly heavy. "I feel," he whispered, surprised by his own honesty, "as though I am becoming one of those maps, fading, brittle, brushing against the world and losing a little more of myself each time." Elara sat in the chair opposite him. The shop was dimming as the street lamps outside flickered to life, casting amber rectangles onto the floorboards. "We are all fading, Alistair. That is the nature of being alive. We are all being slowly erased by the days, but there is a sweetness in the softening, if you let it happen." "Sweetness," he scoffed gently, "it feels like failure." "Only if you think the goal is to remain a statue," she replied. She poured the tea. It was a pale, honeyed amber. "Drink this. It's linden flowers and dried pear. It's meant to quiet the heart." He took the cup. The warmth seeped into his palms, a direct challenge to the chill that had settled in his marrow. He thought about the phrase sweet medicine. He had always associated medicine with bitterness, the harsh chemicals of his trade, the stinging tinctures used to kill mold on ancient parchment. But this was different. This was a remedy administered through the senses, a slow-release infusion of gentleness. He watched her hands as she folded a linen napkin. He thought about the maps again, but this time he didn't see the islands vanishing. He saw them changing. He saw the beauty in the blurred line where the land met the sea, the area that the cartographers called the intertidal zone. It was a place that belonged to neither, a place of constant flux. "Why are you so kind to me?" he asked. The question was naked, stripped of his usual academic veneer. Elara looked at him, her expression unreadable but profoundly present. "Because you walk as if you were carrying the entire 18th century on your shoulders, Alistair, and because I think you've forgotten that tenderness is not a weakness, it's the only thing that keeps the edges from cutting us." They sat in silence for a long time. The rain intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm against the roof, but inside the shop, the air remained still and fragrant. Alistair found himself noticing things he usually ignored, the way the light caught the dust motes, the rhythmic ticking of a clock in the back room, the soft rise and fall of Elara's breathing. He realized then that his life had been a series of restorations, but he had never restored himself. He had been so busy mending the past that he had neglected the living tissue of his own present. He had treated his heart like a museum piece, something to be kept behind glass, away from the light, away from the humidity of emotion. "I don't know how to do it," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "How to let the softening happen." "You start by putting down the brush," she said softly. "You start by acknowledging that you are not a map. You are the traveller, and travellers get tired, they get cold, they need to stop for tea." She smiled then, a small, private curve of the lips that felt like a gift he hadn't earned. Alistair took a sip of the tea. It tasted of summer afternoons and forgotten orchards. It tasted like the opposite of ink. As the liquid travelled down his throat, he felt a strange sensation, a loosening in his shoulders, a relaxation of the muscles around his eyes. The world didn't feel quite so sharp. The edges of the table, the rim of the cup, the shadows in the corner, they all seemed to have lost their jaggedness. He stayed until the shop's closing time, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to rush back to the safety of his studio. When he finally stood to leave, he felt lighter, as if he had left a portion of his heavy, invisible luggage behind in the wingback chair. At the door, he paused. Elara was gathering the empty cups. "A lot." She turned, the candlelight catching the silver threads in her hair. "Thank you for the medicine." She nodded once, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. "The prescription is the same for tomorrow. Alistair, don't be late." He stepped out into the Bristol night. The rain was still falling, but it no longer felt like a cold intrusion, it felt like a cleansing. He walked down Marigold Mews, his boots splashing in the puddles, and for once, he didn't worry about the oxidation of his soul. He thought instead of the linden flowers and the dried pear, and the way a single touch could anchor a man more firmly than any map. The maps would still be there tomorrow. Flaking and fragile, he would still spend his hours with his needlepoint brush, fighting the erasure of history. But he knew now that the most important work wasn't the restoration of the paper, it was the quiet, daily act of allowing himself to be mended by the world's small, recurring tendernesses. Alistair Finch turned the corner toward his flat, his heart no longer a museum piece, but a living thing, beating a slow, rhythmic gratitude against the damp English night. He was still a man of lines and ink, but the ink was no longer his only language. There was a new vocabulary forming in the spaces between his breaths, a language of warmth, of steam, and of the sweet, necessary medicine of a gentle hand. The morning light in the studio on St. Nicholas Street was a thin, watery grey, filtered through decades of soot and the persistent Bristol drizzle. Alistair Finch sat at his workbench, his spine curved like a question mark over a 17th century nautical chart of the Somerset levels. Normally, the silence of the room was his sanctuary, a vacuum where the messy, entropic world outside ceased to exist. Today, however, the silence felt hollowed out, a brittle shell that rattled with every breath he took. His eyes, usually clinical and detached, kept wandering from the frayed vellum to the porcelain mug on his desk, an unremarkable object. Yet it seemed to pulse with the phantom heat of the previous evening. He picked up a badger hair brush, intending to lift a bloom of foxing from the corner of the map, but his hand hovered. For the first time in his career, the permanence of the ink felt like a threat rather than a comfort. He thought of Elara's words, the idea that he was a traveller, not a map. A map was a static thing, a promise of a world that had already been conquered and measured. A traveller was a creature of uncertainty, susceptible to the weather, the terrain, and the slow, grinding fatigue of the road. The studio smelled of isopropanol and the faint, sweet rot of ancient glue. It was a sterile scent, the smell of preservation, of holding back the tide of time. Yet, as he worked, the scent of linden flowers and dried pear seemed to cling to the wool of his jumper, a stubborn olfactory ghost that refused to be exorcised by the chemicals of his trade. He found himself dissecting his own internal geography with the same precision he applied to the Somerset coastline. There were areas in his mind vast, uncharted territories of grief and loneliness that he had marked with the metaphorical equivalent of Hicks-Suntra cones. He had spent years circumnavigating these regions, building high walls of academic rigor and professional detachment to keep the monsters at bay. By mid-afternoon, the light began to fail, plunging the studio into a premature amber twilight. Alistair found he could no longer focus on the minute fishes in the parchment. Each stroke of his brush felt like an imposition, an attempt to force the world back into a shape it no longer wished to inhabit. He thought of the intertidal zone Elara had mentioned, that blurred, shifting space where the sea met the land. Perhaps his mistake had been trying to live entirely on the shore, terrified of the salt and the pull of the moon. He closed his eyes and saw her face not as a portrait to be restored, but as a living presence, a landscape that changed with every shift of the light. He remembered the way she had looked at him, as if she could see the 18th century weight on his shoulders, and was simply waiting for him to decide to put it down. It was a terrifying kind of witness. Most people looked at Alistair and saw a scholar, a craftsman, a man of quiet competence. Elara saw a man who was cold, and she had offered him tea. The walk back to Marigold Mews felt shorter than it had the day before. The city of Bristol, with its steep hills and maritime echoes, seemed less like a backdrop and more like a participant in his internal shift. He noticed the moss in the cracks of the pavement, the way the dampness made the brickwork of the old warehouses glow like bruised plums. He was no longer just moving through space, he was feeling the texture of it. When he pushed open the door to the tea shop, the bell gave its familiar silver chime. The air inside was a warm embrace, thick with the scent of cloves and something earthy, perhaps beetroot or damp cedar. Elara was behind the counter, her hands busy with a small silver tin. She didn't look up immediately, but a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "You're 4 minutes early, Alistair," she said, her voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "The kettle hasn't even reached its first bloom." "I found the studio restrictive today," he admitted, moving toward the same wingback chair as if it were a station of the cross. "The walls haven't moved," she said, finally looking up. Her eyes were bright, catching the golden glow of the lamps, but perhaps the person inside them has. She didn't ask him what he wanted. She moved with a fluid, unhurried grace, selecting herbs from various jars with the intuition of a chemist and the soul of a poet. He watched her, fascinated by the lack of artifice in her movements. In his world, everything was calculated: the ratio of solvent to water, the angle of the blade, the pressure of the hand. Elara seemed to operate on a different frequency, one tuned to the subtle requirements of the moment. She brought him a different cup this time, a heavy, earthenware mug the colour of a stormy sky, lavender, valerian, and a hint of honeyed oats, she murmured, setting it down. "For the man who has spent too long staring at the stars and forgotten how to feel the earth beneath his feet." Alistair wrapped his hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into his palms, easing the ache that had settled into his joints from years of meticulous, cramped work. He took a sip, and the flavour was a revelation: soft, floral, and deeply grounding. It didn't taste like a drink, it tasted like a permission. "I spent the morning thinking about the Somerset levels," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, less clipped, more resonant. "About how the land there is never truly land. It's always half-drowned, always negotiating with the Bristol Channel. I've spent my life trying to draw a firm line between the two, to keep the water from reclaiming the fields." Elara sat in the chair opposite him, leaning back with her hands folded in her lap. "And why is that so important to you? The keeping of the line?" "Because if the line vanishes, the map is useless," Alistair replied. "If everything is fluid, how do we know where we are?" "Perhaps we aren't meant to know," she suggested softly. "Perhaps the where is less important than the how. How are you sitting in this chair? How are you breathing? How does the tea feel against your tongue?" Alistair looked down at the swirling liquid in his cup. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability, a sensation like a protective layer of skin being peeled back. He had spent so long defining himself by what he knew, by the vast archives of historical data he carried in his head. Without that, who was he? Just a man in a damp coat, sitting in a quiet shop, feeling a strange, terrifying tenderness toward a woman he barely knew. "I feel unanchored," he confessed, the words escaping before he could vet them. "Good," Elara said, and for the first time, there was a flash of something fierce in her expression. "An anchor is just a weight that keeps you from moving. You've been anchored in the past for far too long. Alistair Finch, it's time you let the current take you for a bit. You might find that the water isn't as deep as you feared." They sat in the gathering dark, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the distant, muffled roar of the city. Alistair felt the medicine of the tea working its way through him, not just relaxing his muscles, but softening the very architecture of his thoughts. The intertidal zone no longer seemed like a place of danger. It seemed like a place of possibility, a space where the rigid structures of his life could dissolve and be reshaped into something more resilient, something more human. He looked at Elara, and in the dim light, she seemed less like a stranger and more like a mirror. She was showing him a version of himself he hadn't dared to imagine, a man who could be mended, not just restored. A man who could accept a cup of tea as a sacred offering, and who could find, in the simple act of sitting still, a journey more profound than any he had found in the margins of a map. The silence that followed was not the hollow vacuum of a lonely room, but something dense and textured, like a heavy velvet curtain drawn against the world. Alistair looked down at his hands. They were the hands of a man who dealt in certainties long, steady fingers calloused by the constant pressure of the drafting pen and the fine-edged scalpel. For 20 years, those hands had been his only true confidence, the instruments through which he imposed order upon the chaotic remnants of the past. He thought of the vellum maps currently sitting on his workbench back in Clerkenwell, their edges curled like dried leaves, their ink fading into the ghost of a geography that no longer existed. He had always seen himself as a guardian of those ghosts. He believed that if he could only fix the lines, if he could only stabilize the decay, he could prevent the world from sliding into the abyss of forgetting. But sitting here, with the scent of lavender and honeyed oats rising in a gentle steam from his mug, the maps felt like nothing more than paper, beautiful, intricate, but ultimately brittle. "You're thinking about the ink," Elara said. It wasn't a question. She had moved to a small wooden table near the window, where a sprawl of dried botanicals lay waiting to be sorted. "I'm thinking about how much of my life I've spent trying to make things permanent," Alistair replied, his voice a low thrum in the quiet shop. "I've spent months on a single square inch of parchment, trying to ensure that a coastline drawn in 1742 remains visible for another century. I've treated time as an enemy to be fought with chemicals and precision." He looked at her, really looked at her, in the softening light. She was younger than him, perhaps by a decade, but she possessed a stillness that felt ancient. There was a smudge of green powder on her cheekbone-crushed nettle, perhaps, or dried mint, and the sight of it, so mundane and uncalculated, sent a strange jolt through his chest. It was a beautiful, human inconsistency. "And now?" she asked, her hands moving deftly as she separated stalks from leaves. "Now the ink feels heavy, as if I've been carrying the weight of all those lost voyages and forgotten borders in my own veins." He took another sip of the tea. The warmth was no longer just a physical sensation, it felt like a dissolution. The rigid architecture of his identity, Alistair Finch, the preeminent restorer of the Royal Geographical Society, was beginning to soften, the mortar crumbling to reveal something raw and unformed beneath. He thought of his flat in Highgate, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and its air of preserved silence. It was a museum of a life, a place where everything had its designated coordinate. He had chosen it for its lack of surprises. He had built a fortress of intellect and habit, convinced that safety lay in the absence of the unknown. "The Somerset levels," he began again, the memory clearer now. "My father took me there when I was 8. He was a surveyor. A man who believed that everything could be measured if you had a long enough tape. I remember watching him struggle with the tripod in the mud. He was so angry that the ground wouldn't stay still. He called it untrustworthy land. I think I've spent my whole career trying to make the land trustworthy, to make it hold its shape." Elara stopped her work and turned to face him fully. The amber light of the shop caught the gold in her eyes, making them seem like pools of sun-warmed resin. "But the land is alive, Alistair. Anything that stays perfectly still is dead. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. The marsh breathes. If you stop the breathing, you kill the thing you're trying to save." She stood up and walked toward him, not stopping until she was standing just a foot away. The air around her smelled of damp earth and crushed petals, a scent that bypassed his logical mind and spoke directly to something primal and half-forgotten. "Restoration isn't about making things look new," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of silk. It's about allowing them to be whole again, and wholeness includes the scars. It includes the places where the ink has run. She reached out, her movement slow and deliberate, giving him every chance to pull away, but Alistair remained motionless, his breath catching in his throat. She didn't touch his face. Instead, she laid her hand over his on the handle of the earthenware mug. Her skin was warm, slightly rough from her work, and the contact felt like a circuit being closed. For the first time in years, the internal monologue that usually narrated Alistair's life, the constant stream of data, the cross-referencing of facts, the cautious weighing of risks fell silent. There was only the weight of her hand, the heat of the tea, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, which no longer sounded like a countdown to some inevitable decay, but like a heartbeat. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to tell her everything, not about his work, but about the dreams he had stopped having, the way the light hit the Thames at dusk, the terrifying loneliness of a life lived in the margins. He wanted to spill his own ink, to let the colours of his inner world bleed into hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to be unanchored." "You're doing it right now," Elara said, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "You've stopped fighting the current. You've stopped trying to map the room, and you're just in it." She withdrew her hand, but the warmth remained, a lingering brand on his skin. She walked over to a shelf and retrieved a small, blue glass vial stoppered with cork. "Take this," she said, handing it to him. "It isn't for your nerves or your joints, it's for your eyes. A few drops in your tea every evening. It won't help you see the lines on your maps any clearer, but it might help you see the space between them." Alistair took the vial, the glass ghoul, and smooth against his palm, he felt as though he were being handed a key to a door he hadn't known existed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach, but it was being eclipsed by a burgeoning curiosity, a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy yet strangely light. The shop seemed to have grown smaller, more intimate, the shadows stretching out to embrace them. He realized then that he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to return to the sterile precision of his studio or the curated silence of his flat. He wanted to stay in this intertidal zone, where the boundaries were blurred and the map was yet to be drawn. "Thank you, Elara," he said, using her name for the first time. It felt like a discovery, a word with its own weight and texture. "Go home, Alistair Finch," she said softly, moving back toward her herbs. "Sleep without a lamp. Let the dark be dark. I'll see you when the tea runs out." He stepped out of the shop and back into the London night. The air was crisp, the mist thickening as it rolled off the river, but the city no longer felt like a hostile labyrinth. The streetlights reflected in the damp pavement looked like fallen stars, and as he began the walk toward the tube station, Alistair noticed that his pace was different. He wasn't marching toward a destination, he was moving through a landscape. He reached into his pocket and curled his fingers around the small glass vial. He thought of the Somerset levels, the way the water and the land negotiated their existence every day, never quite one or the other, but always both. He felt a strange, quiet joy. The lines were blurring, the ink was running, and for the first time in his life, Alistair Finch was not afraid of the flood. The journey back to Middleton Square felt less like a transit and more like a translation. For years, Alistair Finch had moved through London as if navigating a series of geometric constraints, his mind a relentless engine of coordinates and topographical data. Now, the damp pavement of Clerkenwell didn't just reflect the street lamps, it seemed to exhale them, the light dissolving into the mist in a soft, watercolour bleed. He found himself pausing at the corner of Rosebery Avenue, not to check his watch or calculate the most efficient route, but to watch the way a discarded newspaper tumbled in the winder frantic. White bird seeking a sky that didn't exist. When he reached his flat, the silence that usually greeted him a silence he had curated like a museum exhibit felt brittle and artificial. He moved through the rooms without turning on the main lights, guided by the orange glow of the city filtering through the thin curtains. The air in his study smelled of vellum and stale coffee, the scent of a man who had tried to archive his own existence. He looked at his drafting table, where a half-finished map of the Somerset levels lay pinned under brass weights. The lines were perfect, the elevations precise, yet it looked to him now like a skeleton accurate, perhaps, but devoid of the breath and mud of the living world. He set the kettle to boil, the sound of the rising steam a low, rhythmic sigh in the darkened kitchen. From his coat pocket, he withdrew the blue glass vial. It caught the stray light, a shard of fallen evening held in his palm. Elara's instructions echoed in the quiet spaces of his mind, let the dark be dark. As the tea steeped, Alistair did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He sat in the armchair by the window and did nothing. He didn't reach for a journal, he didn't review his schedule for the following morning, he didn't fret over the slight tremor in his hands that usually signaled a descent into cold, clinical anxiety. He simply sat, he watched the shadows of the plane trees outside dance against his ceiling, their movements chaotic and unmapped. He uncorked the vial. The scent that wafted from it wasn't herbal or medicinal in any way he recognized. It smelled of rain on hot stone and the cold, metallic tang of a coming winter. He let 3 drops fall into his tea. They didn't dissipate immediately but sat on the surface like oil, swirling into iridescent ribbons before vanishing into the amber depths. With the first sip, the internal architecture of his mind seemed to shift. It wasn't a sudden epiphany or a surge of euphoria, but rather a slow, deliberate loosening of a knot he had forgotten he was carrying. The rigid grid of his thoughts began to soften at the edges. He thought of his life, the decades spent seeking the safety of the definite, and realized that his fear of the flood had been a fear of his own depth. He had been a cartographer who refused to sail, a man who preferred the symbol of the river to the cold, wet reality of the current. Wholeness includes the scars, she had said. He looked down at his hands in the dimness. They were the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime holding on to tight. He let his grip relax, feeling the weight of the mug, the warmth of it seeping into his bones. He thought of Elara in her shop, surrounded by the scent of crushed petals and old paper, and he understood that her gift wasn't the liquid in the vial, it was the permission to be unfinished. Sleep came for him there, in the chair, not as a lapse in consciousness, but as a gentle immersion. He dreamed not of maps, but of the spaces between the lines, the vast, unnameable territories where the ink ran dry and the imagination took root. He dreamt of a tide coming in, not to drown the land, but to marry it. He woke to the grey, bruised light of a London dawn. The city was beginning its low, mechanical hum, but the sound didn't grate against his nerves as it usually did. He felt a strange, buoyant equilibrium. He stood up, his limbs feeling supple, the phantom weight that had sat upon his chest for years finally lifted. He didn't return to the drafting table. Instead, he dressed with a deliberate, unhurried grace and walked back out into the morning. The air was sharp and tasted of salt, a reminder that the river was always moving, always negotiating its way toward the sea. When he reached the narrow street, where the shops sat tucked between the towering brickwork of the old warehouses, he saw that the lights were already on. The golden glow spilled out onto the cobbles, a warm invitation in the monochrome morning. He didn't hesitate this time. He didn't check the address or adjust his collar. He simply pushed the door open, the bell chimming a clear, resonant note that sounded like a homecoming. Elara was there, standing by the counter, her hand stained with the dark indigo of a restorer's ink. She didn't look up immediately, but a small, secret smile played at the corners of her mouth. "The tea ran out sooner than I expected," he said, his voice steady, anchored in the present moment. She looked up then, her eyes bright with a quiet, ancient intelligence. It didn't run out, Alistair. You just stopped trying to measure how much was left. He walked toward her, moving through the shadows and the scent of dried lavender, no longer a man lost in the margins, but a man finally stepping into the center of his own story. The map was gone, the lines had blurred, and as he reached out to touch the worn wood of the counter, Alistair Finch realized that for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he was.